Board refreshment may seem like a numbers game at some companies. Years served, age reached. But curiosity, not tenure, is a key factor that determines whether a director still contributes effectively. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Evelyn Dilsaver, a director on the board of Bailard Health Equity and Somnigroup International, speaks with NACD advisor Susan Paley. Together, they discuss board refreshment strategies. They explore the mechanisms used for board refreshment, how to safeguard institutional knowledge, and why board culture and refreshment go hand in hand. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Evelyn, thanks so much for joining us today. What does the term board refreshment mean, and why is it needed?
Thank you for having me, Susan. This is an important topic. And board refreshment is really all about understanding whether you have the right board directors to help the company with their long-term strategy. And there's many ways to go about doing it.
Does a board get refreshed on a usual cadence, or does it need to figure out if an event necessitates board refreshment and they have to make some kind of upset to the apple cart?
Not every company will do a board refreshment. In fact, only 5% of the Russell 3000 companies have specific term limits, for example, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years. So it's a small number. So not everybody will move forward with board refreshment, but I think it's really important because things are changing so fast. So you need to understand whether your board of directors have the skill set to be able to help the company with their long-term strategy. And board refreshment can take many forms. It can be based on term limits. It can be based on age. And there's some automatic tools that help you with a board refreshment. It's really about board succession planning.
So, Evelyn, do I need to be sure that my board is refreshed only when it's not functioning well, or can it be refreshed when it's a high-functioning board?
Yes, it can happen, even if everything is functioning at a high level. And again, it does get to the strategy and term limits. So, for example, one of my companies has a guideline of 10 to 12 years as term limits, and they can extend you beyond that, say from 10 to 12. But there's a normal cadence of having a discussion with the board member to say, are you still interested in serving? Are you still contributing? This leads to individual board director evaluations. And again, not everybody does this, but it's probably the best governance practice to have individual board director evaluations. We can go into that, but they don't have to be done every year. But it helps the board of director understand, how am I contributing? How would my board members like me to contribute more of? And what would they like me to do less of? And that really does help. The other thing is very specific about board culture. The NACD, as you guys know, came out with a white paper several years ago about board culture. And I've actually used it in a couple of my companies to really define what is our board culture around operating models, and how does our board culture coincide with the culture of the company? You want to make sure your culture supports the company's culture. In other words, you're not at opposite ends. I tell you, it really does help to understand, how do we make decisions, and are we functioning well as a board?
I can see how that would need to be not a one and done, but an ongoing journey, because culture does, of course, change. It's a breathing, growing thing.
Yes, it does. And actually, the best opportunity to do this is when you bring in a new CEO, because most new CEOs really want to change their culture, whether it's to hold people more accountable or to execute faster. And that's a great opportunity if a board's reluctant to address their own culture to say, how do we support the CEO? And let's take a look at our own behaviors to make sure that we are supporting the new culture that the CEO wants and the success of the CEO. Great opportunity if the rest of the board is reluctant to have that discussion. And you're right, it is an ongoing matter. In fact, I just went through one, and at the end of it, we came out with 3 things that we agree as a board we're going to continue to do. One is call on each other if you dive too deep into the details. The second one is follow up on commitments. In other words, if we've all agreed that this is something that we want the organization to do, we have a regular cadence of the CEO saying, here's what your whiteboard, here's what we agreed we would do, and here's where we are in the process. The third piece is giving each other feedback, which a lot of boards are reluctant to do.
All 3 of those sound a lot like accountability. Sounds like a good idea.
It is. It's very much about accountability. And, we use an outside third party to do the assessment every 3 years. So, and this individual will give the director individual feedback, but you don't have to do it every year. In between years, what we've set up is at the end of every committee meeting and at the end of every board meeting, we have an executive session and we ask each other, are we living up to our commitments? Is there something that we could have done differently that would make us either a better committee or a better board? And are we living up to the 3 promises we gave each other at the end of our last culture session?
What a useful framework for boards or even management teams to think about every now and then checking in with themselves. So you mentioned a few minutes ago tools that are available, and you did drop in a mention of board evaluations. Is that a great way to identify the gaps and the capabilities of a given board when they're thinking about refreshment? And if so, what else would be on that list of tools?
Sure. A lot of boards will create a matrix of skill sets, functional skill sets. And then as a board member, you would fill that in with, sure, I have business process redesign, or I'm a financial expert, or an AI expert, as many are looking today, in cybersecurity. The one thing that I have noticed is when people fill it in, they don't say how long ago they had that skill set. So I've asked them now, could you update this? And don't put that in if it was more than 5 years ago, right? Because, people kind of hang on to that skill even if they're not using it. So one tool is the matrix, and that helps you to understand what skill sets do we need? And at the bottom of that matrix is usually how long has that individual served on the board? And how long has that individual served as a chair of a committee in the board? So that helps the Nom and Gov chair, usually helps to create this along with general counsel. Think about, is it time to move somebody from chairing, say, audit into chairing comp or chairing nominating Gov? So when I first started on one of my boards, I started chairing audit because of my background, but then moved over to chairing nominating Gov. And now I've actually stepped away because as part of succession planning, it's time for others to take the chair role, whether it's Nom Gov. And if I start it myself, then others are willing to move because sometimes people get stuck in their roles and they really don't want to move. And I think it's important for board leadership to be able to move around and understand the issues facing each other. The other thing is, a lot of companies will do an automatic, if you retire from your company or you change roles, you have to automatically tender your resignation. And then the board gets to choose whether to accept it or not. And more often than not, I would say 99% of the time, they say, oh no, we don't want you to retire unless your new obligation takes away your capacity to serve on the board. And then that's the other reason to have a person leave is if they just don't show up for meetings. And, if you're a public company, at least 75% of the time you have to be at those meetings, or they have to report it in the SEC and the proxy. So there are mechanisms like that help you to understand whether I need to refresh an individual or not.
So you're giving us a lot of helpful hints about tools that are useful. And you mentioned earlier in the discussion term limits or age limits. Are there other mechanisms that are used, and are they generally the same across organizations, or does each enterprise develop their own set of mechanisms?
I believe that every organization develops their own. I would say like I said before, only 5% of the Russell 3000 have term limits. And the one that a lot of companies will have is age limits. If you take a look at the boards, the average age of a board director is in their 60s, 50s, 60s, and they usually want you to retire by the time you're 75. Having said that, to me, it's not about age. I believe in term limits because you can be curious and engaged when you're 85, and you could be not curious and not engaged when you're 40. So it really, to me, is about the individual and whether they have that curiosity in them to continue to learn. It's all about continuous learning. So to me, it's not an age thing. And if I were to vote for age or term limits, I would be term limits.
Interesting. And I heard you mention more than once the word curiosity or curious. Does that rank as your top, let's say, requirement or desire for a great board member?
It does. It does. You have to be passionate about the company you're involved with to be able to both learn and contribute. I've been asked to be on some technology boards, and if I don't even understand what they do, even after they've explained it to me, I know I can't serve on that board. So to me, it's all about curiosity and willingness to learn. One of the CEOs I worked with said his best hires are the ones that show leadership skills and curiosity over functional skills, because you can take that leadership and curiosity and move it in a lot of directions. I serve on multiple boards on multiple companies and industries, and part of that is because you bring perspective. When you're exposed to a lot of different organizations and different industries, you can bring those different perspectives to the organization that you're with. Even if, for example, you're in banking, a lot of the great compliance and regulatory behaviors that banking board of directors have can actually be transferred into other organizations where it might be weaker, but they need it. For example, healthcare.
So, Evelyn, you mentioned passion and curiosity, and I'm imagining that you could have a passionate, curious director who's many years into their tenure. It's time for them to roll off because of some limit that impacts them. And when that person disappears, I would imagine that the board loses an enormous amount of institutional knowledge and deep, profound understanding of the nuanced issues. So how does a board within the refreshment process balance their retirement strategies with institutional knowledge going out the door with all the elements that you want to hang on to?
That's really a great question. One of my boards, we had an activist fight, and I chaired the shareholder outreach program, and I asked the shareholders about board tenure. And they said, we love board members who have been there a long time because of exactly what you just said, Susan, that institutional knowledge. But a good board succession plan will bring in new board members and help them through the board recruitment process and the onboarding to understand the nuances. And many boards will also do a buddy program. So that person with the institutional knowledge will be the person to be the buddy to a brand new board member. And then the more exposure you have, the more knowledge you'll gain. The other thing that I think is important, and actually 3 of my boards do this, every board member attends all the committee meetings. And I know that's unusual, but I will tell you, you get a fast understanding of what's happening in the organization, the nuances and issues of each committee. And then by the time you get to the board, nobody has to do a report out because they've all participated and heard the issues. And it makes the board meeting go much faster because you're not doing report outs and you're really focused on what are the issues, what's the strategy, and how we are addressing them. I love it.
Yeah, I can see the energy when you're talking about it, and I can hear it. You just mentioned some absolutely brilliant tactics, the buddy system, the onboarding, and some really intentional methodology. When it comes to board succession planning and refreshments, is there anything else that you'd list as your favorite go-tos for ensuring a wonderful process and final result? And on the flip side, I'll close with the other side, sort of underbelly of that question is, what's an avoidable refreshment mistake that you maybe have seen boards make and you would advise against?
Well, I chair nominating gov for a couple of my organizations, and to do a board refreshment, you have to have the CEO and the chair of the board on board. In other words, they're willing to have the discussion. Been on some boards where the chair of the board dominates the board meeting, refuses to consider his or her own succession plan, and that makes it much harder to have the discussion with the full board, even though many other members of the board would like to have a succession plan. So they understand, once I come on board, what's my role? When do I get to do a chair of a committee role? Because a lot of people like to have that opportunity to do that. A succession plan that has gone wrong is one not that I experienced, but one that a board colleague of mine experienced. They were bringing in a new board member to be the successor to the chair of the board, and they did not give that individual time to acclimate into the boardroom before they gave the title to that person as chair of the board. And 6 months later, they discovered he was not right for the culture of the board, which again is important. If you've got that culture statement, when you bring somebody on board and you interview them against those cultural values. It's not so much about the duties. It's about, will you fit in? Do you have the courage to address issues? Do you have the curiosity? And are you strategic thinking versus wanting to run the business? Because that was the mistake that was made. This individual wanted to be chair of the board, was past chair of a board of another company, but was brought into this company as chair of the board and was not the right fit for the culture. So we're going through another process right now. And we're all saying, okay, we're going to bring this person on board and see how they act for the first year. So we're not bringing on somebody to be chair of the board. We're bringing on somebody who might possibly be chair of the board, but we're going to see.
It's a test drive.
It's a test drive.
I was inwardly cringing a little when you were talking about the issue that happened. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are both doing the same and or garnering some good insight from you. Great idea. A 1-year tryout. Well, Evelyn, thank you so much for this great discussion. And I invite our listeners to join us for our next episode where we're going to be looking at this matter from the other angle, which is around offboarding directors. Thanks so much.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.